You already know how to connect with people. You've done it before, maybe last week, maybe 10 years ago, in a conversation that felt effortless and real. You weren't performing. You weren't managing yourself. You were just there, and so were they. And something happened between you that felt like recognition. Then it ended. And you spent the next decade wondering why you couldn't make that happen on purpose. Here's what nobody told you. That conversation didn't work because of luck or chemistry or the right mood. It worked because in that moment, you weren't carrying the story. The story that says you're bad at this, that you're wired wrong, that other people have something you don't. For one brief window, you forgot to believe that, and your real capacity showed up. That capacity never left. The story just got louder. I've watched people spend years refining the wrong thing, their opening lines, their posture, their small talk, while the actual problem sat untouched. The actual problem isn't how you present yourself. It's what you believe about yourself when no one's watching. This isn't a book about techniques. Techniques are the last 10%. This is about the 90% underneath. The invisible architecture of how you read people, how you regulate yourself, how you move through rooms, how you decide every single day whether you're worth being heard. The psychology in here is real. The examples are specific. Some of what you'll hear will feel uncomfortable the moment you recognize it as true. That's the point. Comfortable books don't change anything. What changes things is a slow, honest reckoning with how you've actually been operating. And then, one specific shift at a time, building something better. That's what's ahead. Before we begin, if you're done waiting for motivation to find you, hit like. Not for me, for you. And subscribe only if you're serious about building the version you keep talking about. Chapter 1. The diagnosis that lied to you. You're at a party. You know maybe 3 people. Someone across the room catches your eye and smiles. An invitation. Your chest tightens. You look away. You spend the next 20 minutes near the snack table, checking your phone, waiting for a reason to leave. Later, alone, you tell yourself the same thing you always tell yourself. I'm just not good with people. That sentence, that single sentence has probably cost you more than you'll ever calculate. Not because it's cruel, because it sounds true. It has the weight of evidence behind it. Years of awkward silences, missed connections, conversations that went nowhere. You built a case, and that sentence is the verdict. The problem is, you were never the defendant. The real culprit was something else entirely, and it's been hiding in plain sight. What you've been calling a personality trait is actually a skills gap. Those are not the same thing. One is permanent. The other is fixable. The difference between them is everything. Think about the last time you felt genuinely at ease in a conversation. Maybe it was with your closest friend. Maybe it was discussing something you know deeply. Your job, a passion, a subject you've spent years inside. In that moment, did your so-called social anxiety disappear? Almost certainly it did. Not because you became a different person, because you had the tools. You knew the terrain. Your brain wasn't scrambling to manage what it couldn't predict. That's the whole secret, right there. Your brain generates anxiety when it perceives a gap between what a situation demands and what you know how to do. A new driver on a highway isn't anxious because they're a nervous person. They're anxious because driving fast in traffic requires automatic responses they haven't built yet. Give that person 10,000 hours behind the wheel, and the highway becomes background noise. Nothing changed about their personality. Everything changed about their competence. Social interaction runs on the same mechanism. The person who moves through a room like they own it isn't operating on confidence. They're operating on automaticity. Their responses to social situations, how to enter a conversation, when to listen, how to read what someone actually needs. Those responses have been practiced until they run on their own. They don't think about it any more than an experienced driver thinks about checking mirrors. You've been watching the performance and concluding you lack the gift. You were never watching the practice. Here's the thing, and this one stings a little. The label helped you. That's why it stuck. Calling yourself shy or introverted or just not a people person gave you something. It gave you an exit. It meant you didn't have to try things that might fail. It meant the gap between who you are and who you want to be had an explanation that required no action. Labels that protect us from discomfort have a long shelf life. But protection and progress don't live in the same house. There's research behind this. Not self-help anecdote, actual behavioral science. When people with high social anxiety are taught specific frameworks for reading social situations and managing their own internal state, anxiety scores drop dramatically. Not through years of therapy, not through medication, through skill acquisition. The participants didn't become warmer or more extroverted, they became more capable. And capability, it turns out, is what confidence is actually made of. Not the other way around. Most people believe confidence comes first, that if they could just feel more confident, they'd perform better socially. That's backwards. Competence comes first. You do the thing imperfectly, then slightly less imperfectly. Then one day you do it, and don't think about it. The confidence appears somewhere in the middle of that process, unremarkable, almost unnoticed, like a light that came on while you were looking elsewhere. The educational system failed you here in a specific way. You spent years learning trigonometry and the periodic table and the causes of the First World War. Nobody sat you down and taught you how to read the emotional subtext of a conversation. Nobody explained the psychology of trust, or how to navigate a room where you don't know anyone, or why some people make others feel immediately at ease. These are learnable skills, arguably the most important skills for how your life actually goes, and they were simply never taught. So you learned by osmosis, or you didn't learn at all. And then you decided the failure to learn was something innate about you, rather than something missing from your education. That reframe, I wasn't taught this versus I'm broken, isn't just psychologically gentler. It's more accurate. And accuracy matters here, because you can't fix what you've misdiagnosed. I remember the first time I genuinely understood that social skill was just that. A skill. It didn't make me immediately better at it, but it made me willing to be bad at it while I learned. That willingness is the whole game. Consider what changes the moment you shift your identity from I am socially awkward to I am learning social intelligence. Not the words, the orientation. One is a closed door. The other is a corridor. You stop avoiding situations that feel uncomfortable and start treating them as data. You stop interpreting a conversation that went wrong as evidence of your deficiency and start asking what you'd do differently next time. Every skill develops this way. Piano, surgery, writing. The early phase is uncomfortable not because you're failing, but because your brain is actively building new architecture. The discomfort is the construction. It means something is happening. Here's something most people never consider. The most socially skilled people you know were almost certainly more awkward at some point than you are right now. You're seeing the finished building. You never saw the scaffolding. You never watched them stumble through conversations in their 20s, or rehearse what to say before calling someone back, or lie awake replaying an interaction that went sideways. That history exists. You just didn't have access to it. Your nervous system isn't broken, it's undertrained, and undertrained things can be trained. This chapter isn't asking you to suddenly believe you're good at something you've struggled with your whole life. That kind of forced positivity doesn't work, and you'd see through it anyway. What it's asking is simpler than that. Just consider the possibility, seriously, as a hypothesis worth testing, that the story you've been telling yourself about your social limitations is a story, not a fact, not a diagnosis, a story you adopted because it fit the evidence at the time, before you understood what the evidence actually meant. The evidence meant you hadn't learned the skills yet. That's all it ever meant. What happens next depends entirely on whether you can hold that possibility long enough to act on it. You don't need to believe it fully. You just need to stop using the old story to preempt the attempt. The attempt is where everything starts. Chapter 2. The language beneath the language. Someone tells you they're fine. Their jaw is tight. Their shoulders are pulled up slightly, like they're braced for something. They say the word fine in a tone that clips the end off, fast, controlled. And you say okay, and move on. You just missed the entire conversation. Most people navigate social interaction like they're reading the headline and skipping the article. They process words and respond to words, while an entirely separate stream of information flows past them unread. Tone, micro-expression, postural shift. The way someone's energy changes when a specific topic comes up. This isn't mystical, it's just bandwidth. And right now, you're using about 1/10 of yours. The human face alone can produce thousands of distinct configurations. But what matters isn't the full catalog. It's the gap between what someone's face is doing and what their words are claiming. That gap is where the truth lives. Here's a distinction that will immediately change how you read people. Genuine emotion engages the whole face. Performed emotion uses only the parts that are socially expected. Take happiness. A real smile doesn't just move the mouth. It activates the muscles around the eyes, creating faint creases at the outer corners, a slight brightness in the gaze itself. A social smile, the kind deployed at meetings and networking events, moves only the lower face. The eyes stay neutral. The upper face is still. Once you see that difference, you can't unsee it. And once you can't unsee it, you stop responding to the performance and start responding to the person. Look, frustration is the one most people misread with the highest cost. They see tension in someone's face and treat it as a single thing. But flash frustration, a brief jaw tighten, a quick press of the lips, is completely different from sustained frustration, which shows up as prolonged muscle tension, a deepening furrow between the brows, an overall quality of held-back pressure. One needs a small acknowledgement. The other needs a real conversation. Treating them the same way is how small tensions become large ones. And then, there's what you might call calculated frustration. The person isn't losing control. Their expression is controlled, tight, deliberate. They're choosing to let you see their displeasure without giving you the full emotion. This isn't passive aggression exactly. It's communication. They want you to know something is wrong, They're waiting to see if you'll ask. If you don't, they conclude you either didn't notice or didn't care. Either conclusion damages trust. Vocal tone carries information that frequently contradicts the literal content of speech. Someone can use confident language while their pitch rises slightly, their pace accelerates, their sentences shorten. That combination tells you they don't believe what they're saying, or they do believe it, but they're afraid you won't. Those are different problems requiring different responses. If you only heard the words, you'd respond to the wrong thing. The body operates as a continuous emotional barometer, but it has to be read in clusters. One crossed arm means nothing. Crossed arms combined with a backward lean, reduced eye contact, and a face that's gone slightly flat. That cluster means the person has closed. They may still be speaking. They are no longer open. You can keep making your case, but you're talking at a wall. Something shifted and you missed when. Contrast that with genuine engagement. The body orients toward you. There's a slight forward lean, small, often unconscious. Gestures open outward. Eye contact is direct but relaxed. The face responds expressively to what you're saying, moving with the emotional content of the conversation rather than staying neutral. That cluster means the person is with you, not just present, actually with you. There's a difference. Energy level is one of the most consistently misread social signals. People assume low energy means disinterest or dislike. Often it means the person is depleted. Attempting a deep conversation with someone running on empty rarely goes well, not because they don't value you, but because they genuinely don't have the cognitive and emotional resources to meet you there. Pushing harder when someone's energy is low is one of the most common ways good relationships develop invisible friction. The underappreciated truth here is that energy is often topic-specific, not global. Someone who seems checked out in a meeting about budget compliance might become genuinely alive when the conversation shifts to something they care about. That shift, when it happens, is information. It tells you what actually matters to them. File it. Here's the thing most people never do. They observe signals in isolation rather than establishing a baseline. What matters isn't the absolute level of emotion someone displays. It's the deviation from their normal. A person who's naturally reserved showing unusual emotion, even mild by someone else's standards, is signaling something important. A naturally expressive person going quiet is often signaling something more significant than if a quiet person goes quiet. You can't read deviations if you don't know the baseline, which means the most important social skill isn't observation in the moment. It's the patient accumulation of observation over time. Watch people when the stakes are low. Learn what normal looks like for them, their typical energy, their characteristic expressions, how they hold their body when they're comfortable. Then, when something matters, you'll actually see it. Most of what passes between people, the real content, the emotional truth of an interaction, never gets said out loud. It gets expressed, continuously, in channels most people have never learned to tune into. You've been in those channels your whole life. You just haven't been listening. Chapter 3. What people are actually saying. The argument was about dishes. It was never about dishes. You already know this from your own life. Some version of it. A disagreement that started small and escalated in a way that felt disproportionate, where the surface complaint kept shifting, where resolving the original issue somehow made things worse. That's because the original issue wasn't the issue. The thing people argue about is almost never the thing they need. This is one of the most practically useful ideas in all of human psychology, and most people spend their entire lives working around it rather than through it. Every behavior has a surface layer and a basement. The surface layer is what someone says they want. The basement is why they want it, the need that's actually driving the request, the emotion that's actually fueling the conflict. When you only respond to the surface, you solve the wrong problem. The person feels unheard. You feel like nothing you do is enough, and the same argument keeps returning in different costumes. A person who becomes argumentative every time a new idea gets introduced in a meeting. You might read them as difficult, resistant, territorial. But watch more carefully. Notice when the argumentativeness appears. Is it when they weren't consulted? Is it when someone younger presents the idea? Is it when credit seems likely to go elsewhere? The behavior is a signal. It's pointing at something underneath. Almost always, that something is a need for respect, not agreement, not deference, just to feel that their perspective was genuinely considered before the decision moved forward. Address the basement need and the surface behavior changes, often immediately, and without ever directly discussing it. Security drives more human behavior than most people are comfortable admitting. The person who asks excessive questions before agreeing to anything, who surfaces every possible risk, who seems constitutionally unable to just trust the process. That person isn't being difficult. They're being afraid. Their brain has learned, through some combination of experience and wiring, that the world is a place where things go wrong if you don't watch carefully. Telling them not to worry doesn't help. Demonstrating concretely and consistently that you are reliable, that does. Recognition is quieter and more pervasive than people realize. The need to feel seen, to have your contribution noticed, your effort acknowledged, your presence registered, sits underneath a surprising amount of human behavior. The colleague who volunteers for every visible project. The friend who tells the same story about their accomplishment for the third time. The partner who asks, "Did you notice what I did?" even when the answer should be obvious. These aren't character flaws. They're a need broadcasting on an open frequency, waiting for someone to tune in. When you acknowledge someone's contribution specifically, not generically, not just good job, but you saw exactly what they did and why it mattered. You're not being manipulative. You're meeting a legitimate human need. The behavior that was broadcasting the need tends to quiet down because it's been answered. Here's the uncomfortable part. You do this too. You have a basement layer with its own specific needs, and a significant amount of your behavior, including behavior you might not be proud of, is that basement layer trying to get what it needs through indirect means. The frustration that comes out sideways. The withdrawal that's actually a request for reassurance. The overcommunication that's really about anxiety, not information. Emotional accuracy about yourself is the prerequisite for reading it accurately in others. You can't see the basement in someone else if you've bricked over your own. Reading unstated needs requires moving from a content-focused to a pattern-focused mode of listening. Content listening tracks what's being said. Pattern listening tracks what keeps recurring. What topics produce disproportionate emotion. What the person consistently moves toward or away from. Patterns reveal needs that single statements never will. Someone who brings up fairness in multiple unrelated conversations isn't just mentioning fairness. Fairness is a core value for them, possibly a wound. Something in their past taught them the world doesn't operate fairly, and they're alert for evidence of it everywhere. When you understand that, their responses stop seeming disproportionate and start making complete sense. The shift this requires isn't complicated, but it is demanding. It requires you to be genuinely more interested in understanding someone than in making your own point. That's harder than it sounds, especially in conflict, especially when you're convinced you're right. The pull toward making your case is strong. The discipline is staying curious instead. One specific technique that works immediately. When someone says something that seems disproportionate or confusing, when their response doesn't match the apparent size of the situation, ask yourself what need would make this response completely logical. Not what's wrong with them. What need, if real and unmet, would make exactly this behavior make total sense? Usually, you'll find it within a few seconds. And once you find it, you have somewhere real to respond from. Conversations that reach people, that actually move something, almost always involve this level. Not because the speakers are more eloquent or more persuasive, because they're talking to what's actually there. Most conversations happen between surfaces. The ones that matter happen between basements. Chapter 4. The Architecture of Trust. You meet someone at a work event. Within 10 minutes, you feel oddly at ease. They haven't said anything remarkable. The conversation has been ordinary. But something about being in their presence feels safe. Like you can say the wrong thing and it won't cost you. You drive home thinking about that conversation. You're not sure why it felt different. It wasn't chemistry. It was engineering. Trust doesn't fall from the sky. It's built from specific behaviors in a specific sequence that your nervous system evaluates constantly and mostly below conscious awareness. The person who made you feel at ease wasn't lucky or naturally warm, or at least that's not the operative variable. They were doing things, precise things, and those things have names. The first is presence, real presence, not proximity, not eye contact, not nodding at the right intervals, actual undivided attention directed entirely at you. In an era when most people are managing 3 conversations simultaneously, genuine presence has become so rare that when you encounter it, it registers as something almost physical. You feel it. Your body responds to it before your mind catches up. Here's what presence looks like from the outside. The phone is gone. Not face down. Gone. The body is oriented toward you, not split toward the room. When you speak, the other person doesn't start formulating their response midway through your second sentence. They wait. They let your words actually land. Then they respond to what you said, specifically, not generically. That last part matters more than most people realize. Generic responses, interesting, totally, I get that, signal that the content of what you said wasn't really registered. Specific responses signal the opposite. They prove you were heard. And being heard, genuinely heard, activates something in the human nervous system that is very close to relief. Reciprocity is the oldest social contract in human history. Long before currency, before institutions, before written language, humans survived by exchanging labor, food, protection, care. The brain is still running that operating system. When someone gives you something, time, attention, useful information, genuine support, you feel a pull toward returning it. Not because you're calculating, because you're human. This is why value provision is the foundation of genuine influence. Not flattery, not charm, not making yourself likable. Actual value, the kind that makes someone's situation concretely better. When you consistently provide this without keeping score, without requiring immediate return, you create goodwill that accumulates. People don't forget who helped them when it mattered. They don't forget who showed up. The ethical version of this isn't transactional thinking. It's the recognition that relationships are sustained by mutual benefit over time, and that if you want people to be genuinely invested in your success, the most reliable path is being genuinely invested in theirs first. Vulnerability creates trust through a mechanism most people find counterintuitive. Sharing something real about yourself, not a performance of authenticity, not strategic self-disclosure calculated for effect, but something actually true that carries a small risk, signals that you're not managing the interaction. You're in it. That signal, when it lands, invites reciprocal openness. The person across from you relaxes slightly. They stop performing too. The conversation drops a level, from the social surface to something more real. The calibration here is important. Vulnerability too early reads as unstable or attention-seeking. Vulnerability never reads as guarded and exhausting. The right amount is slightly more open than feels entirely comfortable for the stage of the relationship. That slight discomfort is the cost of genuine connection. It's worth paying. Consistency is the variable most people underestimate. Single acts of warmth or generosity are nice, but they don't build trust. Repeated, reliable behavior over time builds trust. The person who helps you once might be having a good day. The person who helps you 6 times across different circumstances is showing you who they are. Trust is pattern recognition. It takes data. Give it data. I've seen people invest enormous energy in single high-impact gestures, grand expressions of care or effort, while being casually unreliable in small things. That combination doesn't work. The small things outweigh the grand ones. Small things happen constantly. Grand gestures are rare. Your reliability in ordinary moments is what people actually use to calibrate whether you're trustworthy. Shared experience accelerates trust in a way that conversation alone can't fully replicate. When you and another person go through something together, solve a problem, navigate difficulty, build something, survive an uncomfortable situation, you create a shared reference point that bonds. It's why teammates develop connection that casual friends rarely match. Shared struggle compresses the trust-building timeline because it reveals character under pressure. Character revealed under pressure is trusted. You don't need manufactured intensity to create shared experience. Working on a real problem together is enough. Trying something new in the same space is enough. What matters is the doing, not the talking about doing. Deep rapport, the kind that actually sustains relationships and creates real influence, isn't built through technique. Technique gets you started. What sustains it is genuine interest in the other person's growth and well-being over time. When you're actually paying attention to someone's development, noticing when they're stuck, recognizing when they've made progress, caring whether they succeed at things that matter to them, that attention is felt. It doesn't require announcement. The people you trust most in your life almost certainly share one characteristic. They made you feel, repeatedly and over time, that your growth mattered to them. Not just your immediate usefulness, your actual development as a person. That's the architecture. Presence, reciprocity, calibrated vulnerability, consistency, shared experience, genuine investment in someone's growth. None of it is complicated. All of it takes time and attention. Most people want a shortcut to trust. There is no shortcut. There's only the accumulation of specific behaviors, repeated reliably, over enough time for a pattern to become undeniable. The question isn't whether you can build that kind of trust with people. You already know how. You've experienced it from the other side. The question is whether you're willing to be the one who builds it first. Chapter 5. Your internal weather. Your phone buzzes during a meeting. You glance at it. One message, 3 words. From someone you've been tense with. Your chest tightens. Your focus dissolves. For the next 20 minutes, you're physically present and mentally somewhere else entirely. Rehearsing responses, running scenarios, feeling the low-grade heat of something unresolved. The meeting ends. You have no idea what was decided. Your emotional state just made the decision about where your attention went. You didn't. This is the thing most people never examine directly. Emotions don't just color your experience. They determine your effectiveness. When you're regulated, calm, present, internally steady, you think more clearly, read situations more accurately, and respond to what's actually happening, rather than to what your nervous system fears might happen. When you're dysregulated, even the most sophisticated social understanding becomes inaccessible. You know better, and you still react badly. Everyone does. The conventional advice is to control your emotions. That framing is wrong, and it costs people a lot. Emotions aren't problems to be controlled. They're signals to be read. The goal isn't suppression, it's literacy. The ability to recognize what you're feeling, understand what triggered it, and choose your response rather than having your response chosen for you. Most people experience emotions as weather that happens to them. They feel anxious and wait for the anxiety to pass. They feel angry and either explode or white-knuckle it into silence. They feel overwhelmed and go numb. In every case, the emotion is the actor, and they're the stage. The possibility of reversing that relationship, of becoming the actor and using the emotion as information, doesn't occur to most people because nobody taught them it was an option. It is an option. It's trainable, but it starts with something most people skip entirely. Accurate identification. There's a significant difference between feeling bad and feeling frustrated, between feeling nervous and feeling ashamed, between feeling sad and feeling disappointed. Each of these states carries different information and calls for a different response. Collapsing them all into a vague sense of emotional discomfort is like getting a detailed diagnostic report from your car and calling it the check engine light. Technically true, completely useless. Developing emotional granularity, the ability to distinguish between specific emotional states rather than just registering positive or negative, is one of the highest leverage psychological skills available to you. Research consistently shows that people who can name their emotions with precision experience them less intensely and recover from them faster. The act of accurate naming activates the prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for executive function, and slightly dampens the amygdala response. Language used precisely is a regulation tool. So when you notice an emotional shift, stop for 3 seconds and ask, what specifically is this? Not good or bad. Not fine or not fine. What is the actual texture of this feeling? Is it anxious or embarrassed? Irritated or hurt? Disappointed or afraid? The precision matters. It's the difference between fumbling in the dark and turning on a light. Your trigger map is the next layer. Every person has a specific set of situations, types of people, and categories of interaction that reliably produce strong emotional responses. Some of those triggers are obvious. Others operate so quickly that you don't notice them until you're already reacting. Mapping your triggers, deliberately, like fieldwork, gives you a form of advanced intelligence that dramatically changes your performance in high-stakes situations. Look, the goal of this mapping isn't to avoid your triggers. That strategy produces a progressively smaller life. The goal is to stop being ambushed by them. When you know that a certain tone of voice produces a defensive response in you, you can prepare for interactions where that tone might appear. When you know that public criticism activates something old and disproportionate, you can decide in advance how you want to respond, before the activation happens and the decision gets made for you. Daniel was a litigation attorney who became unreasonably aggressive whenever opposing counsel used a condescending tone. Not strategic aggression, the uncontrolled kind that damaged his effectiveness and his reputation. Once he mapped the trigger precisely, something shifted. He realized the condescension was a tactic. It was designed to produce exactly the reaction he'd been reliably producing. Seeing it as a tactic rather than a personal attack changed its meaning entirely. The same trigger, reframed, produced a completely different response. He got calmer. His opponents got more unsettled. His outcomes improved. That's the third layer. Reframing. Not denial. Not toxic positivity. Genuine cognitive reappraisal. Consciously choosing a different interpretation of the same event. The event doesn't change. What changes is what you decide it means. And meaning is where your emotional response actually originates. Someone challenges your idea in a meeting. You can interpret that as disrespect and become defensive. Or you can interpret it as engagement. They cared enough to push back rather than silently disagree. Same event. Completely different emotional consequence. The interpretation you choose determines not just how you feel, but what you do next, and therefore what outcome you actually get. Here's the uncomfortable part. Most of your emotional interpretations were formed early. Some of them were accurate responses to real circumstances at the time. Most of them have been quietly running on autopilot ever since, applied to present situations that share surface features with past ones, but are actually different. You're carrying old software into new situations and wondering why the results feel dated. The physiological layer is where most people underestimate their own leverage. Emotions aren't purely psychological events. They're physical ones. Anxiety increases heart rate, tightens the chest, shortens the breath, floods the system with cortisol. And here's the part that matters. The physical changes feed back into the emotional experience and amplify it. The physiology and the feeling are a loop, which means you can enter the loop from the physical side. Breathing is the fastest available intervention. Not because it's mystical, but because it's the one physiological process that operates both automatically and voluntarily. When you extend your exhale beyond your inhale, breathing in for 4 counts, out for 6 or 8, you activate the parasympathetic nervous system. The body reads the slow exhale as a signal that the threat has passed. Heart rate decreases. Muscle tension drops. The cortisol response begins to quiet. This takes roughly 90 seconds of consistent slow breathing to produce a noticeable shift. 90 seconds. That's the gap between the trigger and the response you actually want to give. The entire practice is learning to make that gap available. I genuinely didn't believe this worked until I tried it in a situation where I had no better option. The shift was real and it was fast. That surprised me enough to take the rest of this seriously. Progressive muscle relaxation works through a different mechanism. Deliberately tensing specific muscle groups for 5 seconds, then releasing completely, interrupts the body's pattern of held tension. The release after the tension is what matters. It creates a physical contrast that your nervous system can register. Working through the body this way, from feet upward, produces a cumulative calming effect that resets your baseline before a difficult conversation. Strategic emotional expression is the layer that most people find genuinely counterintuitive. Once you can regulate your internal state, you have a choice about what to show. This isn't fakery, it's selection. You're not manufacturing an emotion you don't feel. You're choosing which genuine emotion to emphasize, and how strongly, based on what the situation actually calls for. In a negotiation, controlled intensity often produces better outcomes than visible anger. The anger might be real and legitimate, but showing it at full volume gives information away and reduces your leverage. Containing it and channeling it into precise, deliberate language keeps you in control of the dynamic. In a conversation where someone needs support, warm steadiness works better than enthusiastic energy, even if you feel genuinely enthusiastic. Your emotional display shapes the other person's emotional state. That's not manipulation, it's responsibility. The highest version of all of this is what you might call emotional leverage. Treating emotions not as obstacles to manage, but as fuel to direct. Anxiety, channeled deliberately, sharpens focus and preparation. Anger, properly understood, identifies exactly where your values are being violated and what needs to change. Frustration marks the precise location of a blocked goal and can generate the creative energy to find a different path. Maya was an emergency room physician who spent years treating her pre-procedure anxiety as a problem to suppress. When she stopped fighting it and started asking what it was preparing her for, the anxiety became functional. It told her where the risks were. It pushed her to review complications. It made her sharper, not slower. She didn't eliminate the anxiety. She gave it a job. Your emotions have been trying to tell you things your whole life. Some of what they're saying is old news, residue from situations long resolved. But some of it is accurate, current, and useful. The work is learning to tell the difference, not by feeling less, by listening more carefully. Chapter 6, the pause that changes everything. Someone sends you a message that reads as dismissive. You feel the heat move through you, fast, familiar. Your fingers are already on the keyboard. You're typing. The response is sharp, maybe too sharp. You send it. 3 hours later, you wish you hadn't. That gap between the stimulus and the response is where your entire social life is decided. Not in the big moments, not in the considered conversations where you have time to think, in the tiny windows, the ones that close in seconds, where your automatic response fires before your considered self has time to weigh in. Viktor Frankl wrote that between stimulus and response there is a space, and in that space lies our freedom. He wrote that from inside a Nazi concentration camp. If that space was available to him there, it's available to you in a tense meeting or a difficult text message. The question is whether you can access it under pressure, and whether you've built the capacity to use it. Most people haven't, not because they're weak or undisciplined, because nobody taught them how. The default setting is reactivity. Your nervous system developed your automatic responses long before you had the self-awareness to evaluate whether they were serving you. They were optimized for survival in your early environment. They've been running largely unchanged ever since. The automatic response isn't always wrong. Sometimes it's fast and accurate. The problem is you can't tell the difference in the moment. You can't easily distinguish between a response that's appropriately fast and one that's inappropriately automatic. The only way to create that distinction is to build in the pause, consistently, until it becomes its own automatic response. Here's what the pause actually is. It's not a dramatic beat of deep reflection. It's 3 seconds, maybe 5. A breath drawn slowly and released completely. A single question asked internally. Is this response serving what I actually want here? That's it. That's the entire practice in its simplest form. 3 seconds and one question. The leverage that comes from that investment is disproportionate to its cost, in a way that's almost difficult to believe until you've experienced it. The physiological piece matters here. When you're triggered, your prefrontal cortex, responsible for judgment, planning, and considering consequences, becomes partially offline. The amygdala, your brain's threat detection system, takes over. This isn't metaphor. It's measurable changes in blood flow and neural activation. Your thinking literally narrows. Options that would be obvious when calm become genuinely inaccessible. The pause, and specifically the slow breathing within it, begins reversing that physiological state. You're not just waiting. You're actively restoring your own cognitive function. The pattern most people don't notice. Reactive responses feel urgent. The urgency is almost always false. The situation that feels like it requires an immediate response almost never actually does. Someone's provocative message at 11 p.m. does not need a reply before you sleep. The sharp comment in a meeting can be addressed, more effectively, after the meeting. The email that made your jaw tighten deserves a response written after the tightness passes. Urgency is frequently a feeling, not a fact. Learning to question the feeling without dismissing it is part of the work. Your trigger map from the previous chapter becomes your most useful tool here. When you know your specific triggers in advance, you can create specific pause protocols for each one. Not generic pause and breathe, but concrete, tailored responses to the situations where your automatic reactions are most likely to misfire. Look, this level of specificity sounds excessive until the moment you actually need it. Vague commitments to respond better under pressure tend to evaporate exactly when pressure appears. Specific commitments. When I hear a condescending tone, I will take one slow breath before speaking. Hold, because they're encoded clearly enough to activate even under cognitive load. The concept of emotional hijacking is useful here. When a trigger fires at sufficient intensity, the emotional response moves faster than conscious thought. It happens before you're aware it's happening. By the time you notice you're reactive, you're already partially committed to the reaction. The only intervention point that reliably works is before the trigger fires. In the anticipation, the preparation, the decision made in advance about how you want to behave in a situation you know is coming. This is why pre-mortems work better than post-mortems for behavioral change. You can analyze every difficult conversation you've handled badly, extract the lessons, intend to do better, and then repeat the same pattern in the next high-pressure moment. The post-mortem teaches the reflective self. The pre-mortem, spending 5 minutes before a challenging interaction, deciding specifically how you want to show up, teaches the reactive self. That's the self that's actually running the show. There's a specific reframe worth building into your pause practice. When someone behaves in a way that provokes you, ask, what is the most generous interpretation of why they're doing this? Not the most credulous, not ignoring evidence of bad intent when it's genuinely present. The most generous interpretation that's still consistent with the facts. This isn't about letting people off the hook. It's about accuracy. Most provocative behavior isn't about you. It's about the other person's stress, fear, or unmet needs expressing themselves in the direction of whoever is nearby. The colleague who snapped at you in the morning meeting was probably dealing with something before they walked in. That doesn't make the behavior acceptable. But it does make it explicable. And explicable things are less activating than things that feel like targeted attacks. When you operate from the most generous, plausible interpretation, two things happen. Your own emotional response is less intense. It's harder to sustain full reactive anger towards someone you're simultaneously considering charitably, and your response is more likely to address what's actually happening, which tends to produce better outcomes for everyone. Strategic expression, the choice about what to show and how strongly, requires the pause as its prerequisite. You can't choose your expression if you're already mid-reaction. The pause is what creates the choosing. Inside the pause, you can ask, what does this situation actually call for? Not what do I feel like expressing right now? What expression will move this toward the outcome I actually want? Sometimes the answer is showing the emotion directly. Genuine hurt, expressed clearly and without drama, can repair a relationship faster than any explanation. Authentic frustration, named rather than performed, often prompts more real engagement than composed neutrality. The question is whether you're expressing the emotion because it's useful or because you can't stop it. The pause is how you tell the difference. Here's what nobody mentions about building this skill. The early attempts feel artificial. You'll notice yourself pausing and it will feel performed, like you're following instructions rather than being natural. That feeling is accurate. You are following instructions. That's what skill acquisition feels like before it becomes automatic. The awkwardness isn't evidence that this isn't working. It's evidence that new neural pathways are being constructed. The artificiality fades. The capacity remains. The goal isn't to become someone who never reacts. Reaction is human and sometimes exactly right. The goal is to become someone who reacts on purpose, whose response to a given situation reflects a genuine choice rather than an automated reflex inherited from old circumstances. That shift, when it takes hold, changes everything downstream. Because the way you respond to difficult moments is ultimately the way you're known. It's what people describe when they describe you. It's what they're thinking about when they decide whether to trust you with something important. You don't get to choose your triggers. You do get to choose what happens next. Chapter 7. How rapport actually works. Two people meet at a conference. By the end of a 90-minute lunch, they feel like they've known each other for years. Neither of them could explain why. The conversation just flowed. It felt real. It felt easy. They exchanged numbers with the genuine intention to stay in touch, and they actually do. Meanwhile, two other people at the same conference spend the same 90 minutes in careful, polished conversation. Professional, pleasant, completely forgettable. They lose each other's cards without noticing. The difference between those two encounters isn't luck or compatibility or shared history. It's a set of specific behaviors that were either present or absent. Rapport that feels natural is almost always rapport that was built, even when neither person was doing it consciously. The first thing to understand is what rapport actually is beneath the warm feeling of it. It's the experience of being seen accurately, not complimented, not entertained. Seen, perceived with some precision, responded to in a way that demonstrates the other person was actually paying attention to you specifically, rather than performing a social role in your general direction. That experience is rarer than it should be, which is exactly why it produces such a strong response when it happens. Most people try to create connection through self-presentation, through being interesting, impressive, funny, or relatable. That impulse is understandable and almost entirely wrong. The people who build rapport fastest are not the most interesting ones in the room. They're the most interested. The attention flows outward, not inward. The question is always implicitly, what's going on with you? Not here's what's going on with me. Presence is the foundation, and it's worth being specific about what destroys it. It's not just the phone. It's the internal phone, the running commentary in your own head that keeps evaluating the interaction, planning what you'll say next, comparing the current conversation to others you'd rather be having, monitoring how you're coming across. That internal activity is as corrosive to presence as any external distraction. The person in front of you can feel when you're somewhere else. They may not be able to articulate it, but they feel it. The conversation becomes slightly hollow. They start self-editing too. The connection potential collapses before it had a chance. Real presence requires deliberately quieting that internal commentary, not eliminating it. It'll return. But noticing when it's running and redirecting attention back to the person in front of you. This is, at its core, a meditation practice applied to conversation. The object of attention isn't your breath. It's them. Active listening is genuinely different from regular listening, and the difference is specific. Regular listening tracks content and prepares response. Active listening tracks content, emotional subtext, and meaning simultaneously, and then reflects back not just what was said, but what was meant. When you reflect meaning rather than just content, something shifts in the other person. They feel understood at a deeper level than the words. That feeling is rapport. Here's the thing about questions. Most people ask them wrong. The questions that create connection aren't the ones that extract information. They're the ones that invite reflection. What made that experience significant for you? What surprised you about how that turned out? What do you wish you'd understood earlier about that situation? These questions do something that informational questions can't. They help people articulate things they haven't fully articulated before. When you help someone understand their own experience more clearly, you become associated with that clarity. That association is powerful and lasting. Progressive deepening is the technique of following someone's response into its next layer, rather than redirecting toward a new topic. Someone mentions they left a stable career to start something of their own. Most people respond with a new question. What kind of business? Progressive deepening goes into the layer beneath. What finally made you decide to do it? That question reaches the motivation, the fear that was overcome, the values at stake. That's where people actually live. That's where real conversation happens. I've watched people practice this, and it almost always produces the same surprised response from the other person. the slight pause before answering, the sense that they're actually thinking rather than retrieving a cached response. That pause is the signal. It means the question reached something real. Vulnerability is the accelerant, not performed vulnerability, the kind that's deployed strategically to seem relatable. Real vulnerability, sharing something that's actually true, that carries actual risk, that you might prefer to keep polished over, a mistake that cost you something, a fear that still has teeth, a belief you held for years that turned out to be wrong. When this lands authentically, it creates an immediate deepening of the space between two people. The other person's defenses relax. The conversation drops below the surface and stays there. The calibration matters. Early in a relationship, small vulnerabilities, a professional mistake, a moment of self-doubt are appropriate. Deeper ones belong to deeper trust. Moving too fast feels destabilizing. Never moving feels closed. The right pace is slightly ahead of what feels safe, not because discomfort is the goal, but because growth lives just past the comfort edge. Value alignment creates a different kind of rapport than shared interests. Two people who discover they both enjoy hiking have something in common. Two people who discover they share a fundamental belief that honesty matters more than comfort, that growth requires discomfort, that people are more capable than they're given credit for, have something that connects at a level hobbies can't reach. That kind of alignment feels like recognition, like finding someone who speaks a language you thought only you knew. Surface questions reveal interests. Deeper questions reveal values. Ask someone what frustrates them most in other people, and you'll learn more about their core values in 3 minutes than you could from an hour of biographical exchange. Frustration is almost always a values violation. What they find intolerable in others reflects what they hold most important in themselves. Shared experience remains the single fastest trust accelerant available. Not shared history, shared doing, working on something real together, navigating a difficulty side by side, trying something new in the same space. The reason teammates develop bonds that casual friends rarely match isn't time spent together. It's the quality of that time. Challenge, uncertainty, and joint effort compress the trust-building timeline because they reveal character. Character revealed is character trusted. You don't need manufactured intensity to create this. Find something real to work on together. Offer to help with something that actually matters to them. Learn something alongside them. The doing creates shared reference points that become the foundation of the relationship's private language, the shorthand that signals we went through something. Rapport maintenance is underestimated because people tend to invest heavily in building new relationships while letting existing ones quietly atrophy. The relationships in your life that matter most are sustained not by grand gestures, but by regular, small demonstrations of continued care. A message that references something they mentioned 3 weeks ago. A recommendation that reflects their specific situation rather than generic advice. Noticing when something difficult is happening for them and naming it without being asked. These small acts signal one thing above everything else. I'm still paying attention. Not just when we're together, between times too. That signal, ongoing attention, is what differentiates a relationship from an acquaintance. And it's available to you in every relationship you choose to invest in. The question is simply which ones you choose. Chapter 8. The questions that open people. You're in a conversation that's going nowhere. Both of you are talking. Neither of you is connecting. There's a quality of parallel monologue to it. Two people sharing information in the same room without actually meeting. You've been in this conversation 100 times. You'll probably be in it again tomorrow. The difference between that conversation and one that actually matters almost always comes down to one thing. Someone asked a question worth answering. Questions are the most underrated conversational tool available to you. Not because asking questions makes you seem interested, although it does. Because the right question does something structural to a conversation. It opens a door that wasn't there before. It takes two people who were standing on either side of a surface and drops them both through it into something real. Most people ask bad questions by default, not because they're incurious, because they've been trained by social convention to ask safe ones. How's work? How was your weekend? What do you do? These questions have cached answers. Nobody has to think. Nobody has to feel. The conversation moves without going anywhere. The function of a safe question is social lubrication. It signals benign intent and maintains comfortable distance simultaneously. That's useful for the first 30 seconds of an interaction. After that, it's a ceiling. What makes a question genuinely good isn't complexity or cleverness. It's that it requires a real answer, one the other person hasn't pre-formulated, that requires them to actually think about their own experience rather than retrieve a standard response. What's been the most surprising part of that work for you? What do you know now that you wish you'd understood 2 years ago? What made you decide to stay when things got difficult? These questions land differently because they reach toward something specific and lived. The other person has to go inside to answer them. That interior movement is where connection begins. There's a technique worth naming directly: the pivot from circumstance to meaning. Most conversational questions stay at the level of circumstance. What happened? What you do? Where you've been? The pivot moves from the external fact to its internal significance. Not where did you grow up, but what was it like growing up there? And what did you carry from it? Not what do you do, but what drew you to that work originally, and how has your relationship to it changed? The pivot is a single conversational move, but it takes the conversation from biography to psychology, from surface to substance. Here's what most people don't realize. People are almost always more interesting than they seem at the level of circumstance. Give someone a question that reaches their meaning-making layer, and they'll surprise you. The accountant has a philosophy about numbers that connects to something deep about how they see the world. The quiet person at the edge of the room has an interior life richer than their social presentation suggests. The question is what unlocks it. Progressive deepening is the art of following a thread rather than constantly introducing new ones. When someone says something meaningful, something that carries more weight than its surface suggests, the natural instinct for many people is to respond with their own related experience or pivot to an adjacent topic. Both impulses redirect away from the other person at exactly the moment they open something. Progressive deepening resists that impulse. It follows the thread down. Tell me more about that. What did that feel like at the time? What do you think was actually going on there? These aren't sophisticated questions. Their power is directional. They point inward and forward rather than away. They signal that what the other person just said is worth more time and attention than a single exchange. That signal alone deepens rapport. Most people are so unaccustomed to being followed into their own experience that it feels remarkably good when it happens. The listening between questions matters as much as the questions themselves. Strategic listening isn't passive reception, it's active decoding. You're tracking content, yes, but you're also tracking what generates energy and what doesn't. Which topics cause the person to lean slightly forward, and which ones produce a subtle flattening of expression. What they circle back to unprompted. What they mention and then quickly move past. Patterns across those signals reveal what matters to someone at a level their explicit statements rarely capture. Look, the topics someone returns to without prompting are almost always the ones with the most unresolved charge. They're not repetitive by accident. Something is working itself out, or trying to. When you notice that pattern and ask directly into it, you mentioned that twice now and I'm curious about it. You demonstrate a quality of attention that most people have never experienced in a conversation. The response is almost always significant. Calibrating your questions to the other person's communication style prevents the most common misfire in good faith conversation. Asking a reflective, emotionally open question to someone who processes externally and concretely, and having it land as intrusive rather than connecting. Some people move toward abstract and philosophical engagement. They find those questions energizing. Others need to stay concrete and specific. They find abstract questions vague and slightly uncomfortable. The calibration is simple. Start concrete. Follow their lead. If they go abstract, follow them there. If they stay concrete, work with that layer. Don't force the depth they're not ready for. Silence is a question you don't have to ask. After someone says something meaningful, the instinct is to fill the space. With response, with affirmation, with the next question. Resisting that instinct and letting the silence hold for 2 or 3 seconds often produces something more valuable than anything you could have said. The person keeps talking. They go deeper into what they just said. They arrive at something they didn't know they were going to say until the space let them find it. Silence communicates that you don't need to fill the air, that their words don't require immediate processing or performance in response, that you're genuinely sitting with what they said, that communicates respect in a frequency that words often can't reach. The conversational question that's almost always underused. What kind of support would be most useful right now? Or its variants. Are you looking to think this through out loud, or are you hoping for a different perspective? Do you want me to ask questions or just listen? These meta-questions about the conversation itself are so rare that they tend to produce genuine gratitude. They demonstrate that you're not just performing the role of supportive listener. You're actually trying to give the other person what they need rather than what's convenient for you to offer. People almost never ask these questions because they feel slightly awkward or overly formal. They're actually neither. They're just specific. And specificity, in conversation as in everything else, is what produces results. There's one more layer worth naming. The best question you can ask in any significant conversation is often the one you're slightly afraid to ask. The one you've been sitting with, wondering if it's too direct or too personal or too honest. The question at the edge of your comfort is usually the question at the center of what's most worth discussing. Not always, but often enough that the hesitation is worth examining each time it appears. Ask it anyway. Respectfully, curiously, without agenda. See what opens. Chapter 9. Reading the Room, Reading the Power. You walk into a meeting. 8 people around a table. Titles on the agenda suggest the most senior person is running it. But within 3 minutes, something becomes clear. Every time a specific woman near the middle of the table speaks, the room subtly reorganizes itself. People stop side conversations. The most senior person glances at her before finalizing anything. She hasn't raised her voice once. She's not the highest rank in the room. She's the highest status. Those are different things. And if you can't tell them apart, you're navigating with the wrong map. Power in social environments is almost never where the org chart says it is. Formal authority determines who can issue directives. Actual influence determines whose directives get followed with genuine commitment rather than technical compliance. The gap between those two things is where most organizational friction lives, and where most social navigation mistakes get made. Reading power accurately requires watching behavioral patterns rather than reading nameplates. The person with genuine social authority in a group displays specific, consistent behaviors that distinguish them from those performing authority or deferring to it. They speak with deliberate pacing, not slowly to seem important, but unhurried because they're not anxious about being interrupted. They leave space after others speak before responding. They don't rush to fill silence. That comfort with silence is one of the clearest status signals available. Watch who gets interrupted and who doesn't. This is more revealing than almost any other single pattern. High-status individuals in a group rarely get cut off mid-sentence. When they do, the interrupter usually catches themselves and pulls back. Low-status individuals get talked over continuously, sometimes without anyone noticing it's happening. If you want to know the actual hierarchy in a group, track the interruption patterns for 20 minutes. The picture that emerges will be more accurate than anything on the organizational chart. Watch whose unspoken reactions shape the room. When a proposal is made, certain people's expressions get monitored by others before opinions form. A slight frown from the right person can kill an idea before anyone has said a word against it. A nod from the right person can make a mediocre proposal feel inevitable. That monitoring behavior, who people check when something is proposed, identifies the actual centers of gravity in the room. Body language signals status with remarkable reliability. But the key is reading the whole configuration rather than isolated gestures. High-status individuals typically occupy more physical space. Not aggressively, just comfortably. They lean back rather than forward. Their gestures are open and unhurried. They maintain eye contact steadily without it feeling like a challenge. They don't perform attentiveness. They either attend fully or they don't, and both are visible. Lower status positioning contracts. Shoulders pull in slightly. The body minimizes its footprint. Eye contact becomes intermittent, held briefly, then released, as if extended contact requires permission. Speech patterns shift too. Faster pace, higher pitch, more qualifiers. Sentences end with a slight upward inflection that turns statements into implicit questions, seeking validation rather than offering perspective. Once you hear that pattern, you'll notice it everywhere, including, occasionally, in yourself. Here's the thing that most people miss. Status is situational, not fixed. The same person can display high-status behavior in one context and low-status behavior in another. Not because they're inconsistent, but because their actual authority genuinely varies by domain. The senior executive who commands a boardroom might become deferential in a conversation about technology with a junior engineer who knows more. The quiet analyst who defers in general meetings becomes authoritative when the conversation enters their specific area of expertise. Misreading this situational variation in yourself is one of the most common status mistakes people make. Some people carry high-status presentation into every context, regardless of whether their actual knowledge warrants it, and get dismissed as bluster. Others carry low-status presentation everywhere, regardless of their genuine expertise, and get overlooked despite having exactly what the situation needs. The calibration that works is matching your status display to your actual authority in each specific domain. When you know something deeply, speak with the confidence that expertise earns. When you're outside your competence, ask intelligent questions without pretending to knowledge you don't have. That combination, confident in your domain, genuinely curious outside it, is what social intelligence actually looks like from the outside. It reads as secure rather than performing. Raising your status in a group is a slower process than most people want it to be. There are no shortcuts that hold. Status elevation happens through one mechanism, demonstrating genuine value so consistently that the group learns to anticipate it. You can't claim status. You can't perform it into existence. You can only earn it through repeated proof that your contribution is worth attending to. Jessica was a junior analyst at an investment firm, surrounded by senior partners with decades of experience and very little patience for unearned opinions. She didn't try to compete on volume or assertiveness. She would have lost that game quickly. Instead, she focused on one specific contribution, arriving at every meeting with one perspective or data point that nobody else had brought. Not multiple. One. Delivered concisely and without preamble, at an appropriate moment, rather than the first available opening. Over 6 months, the senior partners started specifically requesting her presence in meetings. Not because her formal position had changed, because they'd learned, through repeated experience, that she reliably brought something they would have missed without her. Her status in the group elevated organically, because the group had been given enough evidence to justify elevating it. That's the only mechanism that produces durable status. Everything else is either borrowed or temporary. Alliance structures are the layer beneath the visible hierarchy, the informal coalitions that actually determine how decisions get made and which ideas gain traction. Every group has them. Most people navigate them accidentally. Understanding them allows you to navigate them deliberately. Alliances form around shared interests, shared values, or shared adversaries. They're rarely acknowledged openly, but they're visible in behavioral patterns. Who backs whose proposals, who softens whose criticism, who gets credit distributed toward them when group wins get attributed. Mapping these patterns over several interactions gives you a functional picture of the alliance landscape. Building strategic alliances, the ethical version, means identifying people whose interests genuinely overlap with yours and demonstrating your value to them through consistent, reliable contribution towards shared objectives. Not flattery, not political maneuvering, just being someone whose competence and reliability are recognizable enough that influential people want you in their corner. Look, the fastest way to build alliance is to be visibly useful to someone who matters during a moment when usefulness is genuinely needed. Not performed usefulness. Real help with a real problem. One well-timed, high-quality contribution to the right person's challenge is worth more alliance building than months of general pleasantness. The most sophisticated layer of hierarchy navigation is understanding what threatens people's status and planning accordingly. Any proposal that requires someone to cede authority, share credit, or be seen as having been wrong will activate resistance regardless of the proposal's merit. This isn't pettiness. It's the deeply human experience of status as a resource that feels genuinely scarce. People protect it the way they protect other things they can't afford to lose. When your proposal threatens someone's status, you have two options. You can push through the resistance, which sometimes works, but always costs something. Or you can restructure the proposal so that supporting it actually enhances their status rather than threatening it. Give them meaningful input that shapes the outcome. Frame their prior position as the foundation yours builds on rather than the obstacle it corrects. Find a way for them to be associated with the success rather than positioned as having resisted it. This isn't capitulation, it's architecture. You're not changing what you want. You're changing how getting there looks for everyone involved. The outcome you're pursuing becomes more achievable because fewer people are working against it. Status in groups is ultimately about one question. Are you someone the group needs? Not someone who needs the group, someone the group needs. That shift in orientation is everything. The moment you stop trying to be accepted and start focusing on being genuinely useful, the social calculation changes entirely. You're no longer petitioning for status. You're providing the thing that status is ultimately granted in exchange for. The room you walked into at the beginning of this chapter, the meeting where the woman near the middle held the real power. She didn't get there by wanting it. She got there by repeatedly demonstrating something the group had come to depend on. The attention she received was a consequence of value delivered. It always is. That's the whole architecture. Understand who actually holds influence and why. Match your status display to your genuine authority in each domain. Build alliances through consistent value provision. Protect others' status when you need their support. And focus relentlessly on being someone the group genuinely needs. The hierarchy will respond to that. It always does. Chapter 10. Conflict as information. The email sits in your drafts. You've written it 3 times. It's about something that's been building for weeks. A dynamic with a colleague that's gotten quietly worse with each interaction. A pattern that you've been hoping would correct itself without requiring you to say anything directly. It won't. You already know this. That's why you're on the 3rd draft. Conflict avoidance feels like peace. It isn't. It's the accumulation of unaddressed tension in a container that has a finite capacity. The longer you avoid the conversation, the more pressure builds, until the eventual confrontation happens under the worst possible conditions. When one of you is already at threshold, when small provocations carry months of unacknowledged weight, when the actual issue has been buried under so many layers of accumulated grievance that neither of you can easily find it anymore. The fear underneath avoidance is almost always the same. That the conversation will damage the relationship. That confronting the problem will make it worse. That it's safer to manage around the friction than to address it directly. This is the central lie that conflict avoidance tells you. The truth is that most relationships that end, or become permanently diminished, don't end because someone had a difficult conversation. They end because nobody did. Healthy conflict is not fighting. The distinction is precise and important. Fighting is 2 people trying to win at each other's expense, using the conflict as a vehicle for dominance, humiliation, or the discharge of accumulated emotion. Healthy conflict is 2 people trying to solve a shared problem, using the tension as a signal about where the system between them needs adjustment. Same external situation, entirely different process, completely different outcomes. The signal function of conflict is what most people miss entirely. When tension arises between 2 people, it's almost always pointing at something real, a misalignment of expectations, a violated boundary, an unmet need, a difference in values that hasn't been named yet. That information is valuable. Avoiding the conflict doesn't make the information go away. It just leaves the problem unaddressed, while the relationship quietly degrades around it. When you start treating conflict as information rather than threat, your orientation changes completely. You stop asking, "How do I get out of this?" and start asking, "What is this telling me that I need to understand?" That shift in question changes everything that follows. The positions versus interests framework is one of the most practically powerful ideas in conflict resolution. Positions are what people say they want: specific outcomes, particular solutions, concrete demands. Interests are why they want it: the underlying needs, values, and concerns driving the position. People argue about positions. Conflicts get resolved through interests. Two people can hold opposing positions that seem completely incompatible while sharing underlying interests that point directly toward resolution. The argument about how to structure a project might be a proxy argument about who gets credit. The disagreement about a parenting decision might be a proxy disagreement about whose judgment gets trusted. The dispute about a policy might actually be about whether someone feels respected enough to have been consulted. When you move the conversation from position to interest, not what do you want, but what are you most concerned about here? What matters most to you in how this gets resolved? You frequently find that the actual conflict is much more solvable than the surface conflict appeared. Not always, but often enough that making the move is almost always worth it. Elena and Marcus built a startup together and hit a wall over hiring. Elena insisted on experienced senior hires. Marcus insisted the budget required junior talent. They argued about this for weeks. The positions were genuinely incompatible within their constraints. When they finally stopped arguing about the positions and asked each other what they were actually afraid of, something shifted. Elena's real concern was credibility. She needed investors to see an experienced team or their next funding round was at risk. Marcus's real concern was runway. He needed to preserve cash, or they wouldn't survive long enough to raise again. Neither of those interests required winning the argument about hiring levels. They required finding a solution that addressed both fears simultaneously. The hybrid approach they landed on, senior advisors part-time, junior team full-time, hadn't been visible when they were arguing about positions. It became obvious once interests were on the table. Timing is one of the most consistently underestimated variables in conflict resolution. Attempting a difficult conversation when either party is depleted, distracted, or already emotionally activated is nearly always a mistake. The conversation that could have produced resolution under better conditions produces escalation instead. The same words, same issues, same two people. Different outcomes based almost entirely on when and where the conversation happens. The right conditions for a difficult conversation are boring and unsexy. Both people reasonably calm, adequate time with no hard deadline creating pressure, a private setting that removes audience effects, and enough physical comfort that nobody's basic needs are competing for attention. Most difficult conversations happen under the opposite conditions: in the heat of the moment, in public, under time pressure, when at least one person is already at threshold. The damage done in those conditions often outlasts the original issue. If you have the option to choose the timing, choose it deliberately. A brief message. I'd like to talk about something that's been on my mind. Can we find 30 minutes this week when things aren't rushed? Does more to set up a productive conversation than any technique applied during the conversation itself. The opening of a difficult conversation determines more than most people realize. Beginning with blame, accusation, or a recitation of grievances activates the other person's defensive system immediately. Once someone is defensive, they're no longer really listening. They're preparing their rebuttal. Everything you say after that point is being processed through the filter of how do I respond to this attack, rather than what can I understand from this. Opening with acknowledgement of the relationship's value and a clear statement of collaborative intent does the opposite. It signals that you're not coming in to damage something. You're coming in to protect it. I value what we've built working together, and there's something I want to address before it gets in the way of that. That framing puts both people on the same side of the problem before the problem is even named. I notice rather than you did creates a different starting point than you always or you never. The first opens, the second closes. That distinction seems small. It isn't. Emotional regulation during conflict deserves its own specific attention. Strong emotions during conflict aren't a problem to suppress. They're information, and sometimes they need to be expressed. But they need to be expressed in ways that contribute to resolution rather than escalation. The difference is in how they're named versus how they're deployed. Saying I feel genuinely hurt by how that was handled is different from acting hurt in ways designed to produce guilt. The first is communication. The second is a tactic. When the other person is emotionally activated, visibly frustrated, hurt, or angry, the instinct for most people is to either match the energy or shut down. Both responses make things worse. The third option is to acknowledge the emotion directly without either amplifying it or dismissing it. I can see this matters a lot to you. Help me understand what's most important to you here. This moves the conversation from emotional expression to problem solving without requiring the person to suppress what they're feeling first. Genuine apology is one of the most powerful conflict resolution tools that almost nobody uses well. An effective apology has 4 components: acknowledgement of the specific harm caused, ownership of your actual contribution to it, expressed remorse that's proportionate rather than theatrical, and a concrete commitment to different behavior going forward. Remove any one of those components, and the apology loses most of its function. The apology that's all remorse and no changed behavior is a performance. The one that's all explanation and no ownership is a defense wearing an apology's costume. Look, most people conflate apologizing with losing. It's one of the more expensive confusions available to you. A genuine, well-executed apology doesn't diminish you. It demonstrates the emotional maturity and security to take responsibility without requiring external absolution. That combination, accountability without collapse, consistently builds trust rather than eroding it. The follow-through after a difficult conversation is where most conflict resolution efforts fail. An agreement reached in the room, however genuine, requires structural support to hold. That means specific commitments rather than general intentions. A defined way to check whether the commitments are being met, and an explicit plan to revisit the issue if the pattern recurs. "We'll communicate better" is not a commitment. We'll send a brief update by end of day when timelines shift, and if either of us misses that, we'll address it the same day rather than letting it accumulate. That's a commitment. The more specific the agreement, the more likely it survives contact with reality. The measure of a conflict well resolved isn't the absence of tension after the conversation. It's whether the relationship is stronger than it was before, whether both people feel more understood, more trusted, more willing to bring the next difficult thing rather than managing around it. That's what's available on the other side of the conversation you've been avoiding. Chapter 11. The reputation you're already building. Right now, while you're reading this, you have a reputation. You didn't decide to build one. You didn't sit down and craft a strategy for how you'd be known. But there are people in your professional and personal life who have a clear, specific sense of who you are, what you're like under pressure, whether your word holds, how you handle things when they get hard. That sense was built from accumulated evidence across every interaction you've had with them. The question isn't whether your reputation is being written. It's whether you're an author or just a subject. Most people operate as subjects. They do their work, conduct their relationships, move through their days, and assume that if they mean well and perform reasonably, a positive reputation will follow naturally. Sometimes that's true. Often it isn't, because reputation isn't just about what you do. It's about what gets noticed, what gets remembered, what gets talked about when you're not in the room. Those three things can diverge significantly from your actual behavior without any dishonesty from anyone involved. The most fundamental reputation principle is behavioral consistency, not as a performance strategy, but as the only mechanism through which real trust gets built. When your behavior aligns with your stated values across different contexts, over time, in situations where it would be easier to compromise, people learn that they can predict you. That predictability is what trust actually is at its structural level. You're not trusted because you're likable. You're trusted because your behavior is legible and reliable. The gap between stated values and lived behavior is one of the most reputation-damaging things that exists, precisely because it usually operates below conscious awareness. You say you value honesty, and you largely do, but you soften difficult feedback into ineffectiveness to avoid discomfort. You say you value collaboration, and you genuinely believe it, but in high-stakes moments, you instinctively protect individual credit. These small gaps between principle and practice accumulate in others' perception long before they accumulate in your own. Here's the uncomfortable version. The reputation that matters most is the one you have with people who have seen you under pressure. Anyone can be warm and generous when the stakes are low. What people remember, and what they talk about, is how you handled the situation where it would have been understandable to be otherwise. The meeting that went badly, the project that failed, the moment when you had to deliver news nobody wanted to hear. Those moments define you in others' minds in ways that dozens of ordinary interactions don't. Visibility is the variable that separates good work from recognized good work. Two people can produce equivalent quality and have radically different reputations because of differences in how their work gets seen. This isn't about self-promotion in its self-aggrandizing form. It's about ensuring that genuine contribution reaches the people for whom it would be relevant and valuable. Sophia was a data scientist whose analytical work genuinely informed major business decisions at her company. Her manager presented findings collectively, the analytics team's work, and Sophia remained largely invisible to senior leadership, despite being the primary intellectual driver of the output. When she began adding a brief section to reports explaining the reasoning and assumptions behind key recommendations, signed with her name, framed as analytical context rather than personal credit claiming, executives started registering her existence. They began requesting her involvement directly. Her work hadn't changed at all. Its visibility had. The lesson isn't to take credit aggressively. It's that invisible contribution is effectively non-existent from a reputation perspective, regardless of its actual quality. Finding appropriate, non-obnoxious ways to make genuine contribution visible is not vanity. It's basic professional responsibility to yourself. Association shapes reputation through mechanisms that feel unfair but operate reliably. The people you're consistently seen with, publicly aligned with, and professionally affiliated with become part of how others categorize and evaluate you. This isn't a call to be calculating about friendship or to abandon people going through difficult periods. It's an invitation to be thoughtful about the professional affiliations and visible associations you cultivate, because they send signals you may not be intentionally sending. Being associated with respected, high-integrity people in your field enhances your reputation not through dishonest, reflected glory, but through a legitimate inference. Someone who consistently attracts and maintains relationships with quality people is probably demonstrating the qualities that make those relationships sustainable. Expertise is one of the highest leverage reputation builders available because it's both genuinely valuable and highly visible to the right audiences. Being known as the person who understands something deeply and reliably, who sees things others miss, who makes predictions that come true, who solves problems others can't solve, creates a reputation asset that compounds over time and opens doors that general competence doesn't. Building expertise reputation requires two things operating simultaneously: actual depth of knowledge and appropriate channels for demonstrating that knowledge to relevant audiences. Depth without demonstration is invisible. Demonstration without depth is quickly exposed. When both are present, when you actually know something and find genuine ways to share that knowledge usefully, the reputation that builds is durable because it's based on real evidence. Writing, speaking, mentoring, advising. These aren't vanity activities. They're evidence generation. They create a record of your thinking that exists independent of any single interaction, that can be encountered by people who've never met you, that accumulates over time into something that precedes you into rooms you haven't entered yet. Communication style affects reputation in ways that have nothing to do with the content of what you're communicating. The same insight expressed with hedging, qualification, and excessive uncertainty reads as less credible than the same insight expressed with appropriate confidence and clarity, regardless of the insight's actual quality. I think maybe we should probably consider possibly looking at this differently. Registers as uncertain and easily dismissed. I think we're missing something important here. Registers as confident and worth attending to. Eliminating hedging language from your professional communication is one of the fastest reputation improvements available to you. Not by becoming arrogant or dismissing legitimate uncertainty, but by reserving qualification for situations where genuine uncertainty exists, rather than using it as a default protective layer around every statement you make. Crisis management is where reputations are most profoundly made or damaged, because people's memories for how someone behaved under pressure are long and vivid. The professional who responds to failure with accountability, immediate focus on solutions, and visible learning from what went wrong often comes out of the crisis with a stronger reputation than they had going in. The one who deflects blame, minimizes the problem, or becomes defensive in the face of legitimate criticism confirms something unflattering that people suspected but weren't certain of. How you handle being wrong is your clearest character signal. Not because being wrong is admirable, but because how you respond to it reveals whether your self-image requires the protection of being right. People who can say, "I got that wrong. Here's what I should have seen. Here's what I'm doing differently." Those people get trusted with important things because the people trusting them know the feedback loop is functional. Long-term reputation building operates like compound interest. Consistent small deposits, reliable follow-through, genuine helpfulness, ethical behavior in low-stakes situations where nobody would notice the compromise accumulate into something substantial over years. The person with a truly strong reputation didn't build it through a few dramatic moments. They built it through an unbroken pattern of ordinary moments, handled with quiet integrity. That pattern is being built right now, by you, in every interaction. The only question worth asking is whether you're building deliberately. Chapter 12, Group Mind and How to Move It. You've watched it happen. Someone raises a point in a meeting. It lands flat. A few polite nods, a brief silence. The conversation moves on. 20 minutes later, a different person makes almost the same point. The room responds completely differently. The idea gets traction. People build on it. It becomes the direction. The idea didn't change. The social architecture around it did. Groups are not simply collections of individuals. They're systems with their own psychology, their own emotional states, their own immune responses to threat, their own gravitational fields that pull individual behavior in directions people often don't notice and couldn't easily explain. Understanding those dynamics is what separates the person who watches group outcomes happen from the person who shapes them. The first thing to understand about groups is that they develop cultures, informal, largely implicit rule systems that determine what behaviors get rewarded or punished, what topics are safe to raise versus what remains unspoken, what values the group actually lives by as distinct from what it claims to value. These cultures aren't designed. They emerge from accumulated behavioral patterns, reinforced interactions, and the implicit authority of whoever modeled behavior early in the group's formation. Once a group culture is established, it operates with remarkable power over individual behavior. People who would never interrupt in a one-on-one conversation interrupt freely in groups where that's normalized. People who genuinely value honesty stay silent about real problems in groups where speaking up has historically been punished. The culture is invisible to those inside it in the same way water is invisible to fish. It's the medium everything else moves through. Making the culture visible, naming the implicit norms rather than leaving them unexamined, is one of the most powerful interventions available to a social leader. Not through accusation or confrontation, but through simple observation. It seems like we typically move on from disagreement pretty quickly in our meetings. I'm curious whether that's serving us. That observation, offered without blame, creates a moment where the group can examine its own operating system. Sometimes that's all that's needed to begin changing it. Social proof is the engine driving most group behavior. When people are uncertain what to think or do, they look to others, specifically to similar others, or to respected others, for behavioral cues. This isn't weakness or laziness. It's a cognitively efficient system for navigating complex social environments. The problem is that it means group opinion can shift rapidly based on what high-status members appear to believe, regardless of the underlying evidence. Understanding social proof as a mechanism transforms how you approach influencing group decisions. Trying to convince a group through argument alone, presenting evidence, making logical cases, addressing objections, is fighting the mechanism. Working with the mechanism means securing visible support from respected group members before presenting broadly. One genuine endorsement from the right person is worth more persuasive power than hours of compelling argument. This is why pre-conversation matters more than the meeting itself. The work that determines group outcomes is usually done in the conversations before the formal discussion. The one-on-ones where you understand individual concerns, address specific objections, and build the coalition of visible supporters that will signal to the broader group that the idea has legitimate backing. By the time the meeting happens, the outcome should already be largely determined. If you're trying to win in the meeting, you're starting too late. Building coalitions within groups requires the same foundation as any other trust building: genuine value provision over time. You can't call in coalition support you haven't earned through prior contribution. The person whose proposals consistently get supported isn't more persuasive, they're more invested in. People support their proposals because the relationship has been built, the competence has been demonstrated, and the reciprocity balance is positive. Here's the thing about group decision-making that most people find uncomfortable to accept. Decisions are rarely made on pure merit. They're made through a combination of merit, relationship, timing, framing, and the social dynamics of who's in the room and what they need. The best idea, poorly timed and poorly positioned, loses to a mediocre idea well-timed and well-positioned. Accepting this reality isn't cynicism. It's the prerequisite for operating effectively within it. Group emotional states are real and contagious in ways that have direct neurological basis. Mirror neurons fire when we observe others' emotional expressions, producing a diluted version of the same emotional state in us. In groups, this amplifies. One person's anxiety spreads. One person's calm steadies. One person's enthusiasm ignites. The emotional tone of a group can shift based on a single person's demeanor. And that shift then shapes what decisions get made and how risk gets evaluated. Social leaders understand this and take responsibility for the emotional energy they bring into group settings. Not through forced positivity, that reads as inauthentic and creates its own dynamic, but through genuine regulation of their own state and deliberate calibration of what they project. When you walk into a room that's anxious and you're genuinely steady, the group can feel that steadiness. It doesn't eliminate the anxiety, but it changes the group's sense of what's possible. Reading group emotional states requires attention to collective rather than individual signals. Is energy in the room high or low? Is the general quality of engagement open and curious or defended and closed? Are people building on each other's contributions or talking past each other? Is the group moving toward something or circling? These collective patterns are readable with the same observational skills you apply to individuals. You just have to expand your frame to include the whole system. When group energy is low, when the room feels heavy, defensive, or stuck, trying to push forward on complex or contentious issues almost never works. The group doesn't have the emotional resources to engage constructively with difficulty. The more effective move is either to create a genuine shift in energy through humor, a change of pace, a quick win that rebuilds momentum, or to defer the difficult conversation until conditions improve. Timing group interventions to match group energy is as important as timing individual conversations. Conflict dynamics in groups are more complex than individual conflicts because of audience effects. When disagreement happens publicly, both parties have their status and reputation at stake in front of witnesses. This means face-saving becomes a critical variable. Any resolution that requires someone to visibly lose in front of the group will be resisted, regardless of its merit. Solutions that allow everyone to maintain dignity while addressing the actual issue are not compromise for its own sake. They're the only solutions that will actually hold. Facilitation, The skill of helping a group process information and move toward decisions effectively is one of the most underappreciated forms of social leadership. Good facilitators don't impose direction. They manage the process so the group can find its own best direction. They ensure quiet voices get heard before the room consolidates around the loudest. They surface assumptions that are driving the conversation without being examined. They create closure when the group is ready for it, rather than letting productive discussion exhaust itself into circular repetition. Look, you don't need a formal role to facilitate. You can do it through questions. So we've heard several different perspectives on this. Can we try to identify where we actually agree? Or I want to make sure we've heard from everyone before we move forward. Are there perspectives we haven't heard yet? These moves don't require authority. They require only the willingness to take responsibility for the group's process, rather than just pursuing your own position within it. The highest form of social leadership in groups is developing the group's capacity to lead itself, not centralizing influence in yourself, but distributing it. Actively bringing others into leadership moments, crediting contributions publicly and specifically, creating conditions where people feel safe enough to take initiative. A group that depends entirely on one person for its direction is fragile. A group where leadership is distributed, where multiple people feel ownership of the collective outcome, that group is resilient. The person who builds that kind of group becomes associated with its strength. Not because they commanded it, but because they created the conditions for it. That association, earned that way, is one of the most durable forms of social capital available. The meeting at the beginning of this chapter, the one where the second person got traction on an idea the first person couldn't land. The difference probably wasn't the idea, and it probably wasn't even the delivery. It was the social architecture. The second person had done something before the meeting, built a relationship, demonstrated value, established credibility in this specific domain that made the group ready to receive what they were offering. The meeting is almost never where the outcome is decided. Chapter 13: Who You Become When You Stop Performing. There's a moment that happens quietly, somewhere in the middle of genuine skill development, that nobody warns you about. You're in a conversation, a difficult one, or an important one. And somewhere midway through, you realize you forgot to monitor yourself. You weren't tracking how you were coming across. You weren't managing your expression or calibrating your tone or running the internal checklist. You were just there, fully present, actually responding, genuinely engaged. And it went well. That moment is the one everything in this book has been building toward. Not the techniques, not the frameworks, the disappearance of the gap between who you are and how you function in the presence of other people. Mastery in any domain has a specific signature. The skill becomes invisible. The concert pianist isn't thinking about finger placement. The experienced surgeon isn't consciously managing the instrument. The athlete in flow isn't narrating their own movement. The technical knowledge is fully present. It's just no longer occupying the foreground of conscious attention. It's running underneath, freeing the surface mind for something more important. Actual engagement with what's happening right now. Social mastery works identically. The frameworks you've built, reading emotional states, regulating your internal weather, building trust, navigating hierarchy, asking questions that open people, those don't disappear. They become infrastructure. They run quietly in the background, while your conscious attention is free to simply be with the person in front of you. That's when connection stops feeling like work. The internal audience is what stands between most people and this state. You know the one, the observer that sits slightly behind your own eyes, evaluating your performance in real time. Did that land well? Was that too much? Do they like me? Am I saying the right things? That audience is exhausting, and it's the primary reason social interaction feels effortful for so many people for so long. Here's what dismantles it. Not confidence in the conventional sense. Not telling yourself you're great or forcing a more positive self-assessment. What dismantles the internal audience is competence so thoroughly practiced that performance anxiety loses its grip. When you've had the difficult conversation enough times to know you can handle it, the fear of having it loses its teeth. When you've read emotional signals accurately enough times to trust your own perception, the anxiety about misreading people quiets. The internal audience needs uncertainty to survive. Competence starves it. I still catch the internal audience running sometimes. In genuinely high-stakes moments, it shows up. The difference now is that I notice it and return to the actual conversation, rather than getting absorbed in the commentary. The identity shift that makes everything else sustainable isn't "I am good at this." It's "this is who I am now." Not a performance you maintain. Not a better version you try to remember to be. An actual reorganization of how you move through social reality. What you notice, what you do automatically, who you are when nobody's evaluating you. That shift doesn't happen through insight alone. It happens through repetition across enough varied contexts that the new patterns become the default patterns. Every conversation where you stayed regulated instead of reactive. Every moment where you asked a real question instead of a safe one. Every conflict you walked toward instead of around. Each of those moments is a vote cast for a different identity. The identity doesn't arrive, and then you start behaving differently. You behave differently, repeatedly, and the identity follows. What you'll find on the other side isn't a transformed social life in the dramatic sense. You won't suddenly love every interaction, or find every person fascinating, or feel energized by all the things that used to drain you. Some of that is temperament, and temperament is real. What changes is the absence of the ceiling, the situations you used to avoid because the gap between what they required and what you had felt too wide. Those situations become available. Not easy, necessarily. Available. The conversation you needed to have but didn't. The room you walked away from. The relationship that never developed past a certain depth because you couldn't figure out how to take it further. Those aren't closed anymore. And underneath all the specific skills, the reading, the regulation, the rapport, the navigation, underneath all of it is one thing that was always true and is more available to you now. You were never the problem. The gap was real, but it was always a gap in learning, not a gap in worth. The story that said you were wired wrong, fundamentally awkward, missing something others had from birth, that story was never accurate. It was just the only explanation available before you had a better one. You have a better one now. The rest is practice. Conclusion. You're standing in a room. Maybe it's a party, maybe it's a meeting, maybe it's a conversation you've been putting off for 3 weeks. The old feeling is there. Not gone, but quieter. Background noise rather than the whole broadcast. You take a breath. You look at the person in front of you. Not at how you're coming across to them. At them, actually at them. What they're carrying today. what they need from this exchange, what's moving beneath the surface of what they're saying, and you respond to that. Not perfectly, not without the occasional misread or clumsy moment, but from a place of genuine presence rather than managed performance, from skill rather than luck, from choice rather than reflex. This is what changed. Not the world, not the people in it, not the fundamental difficulty of genuine human connection. What changed is what you bring to the threshold of it. Connection was never the reward waiting at the end of this work. It was always the work itself, the daily practice of showing up more honestly, more skillfully, more fully present than the day before. You already know how to begin. You just did.